Kadak Pritchard pressed his ear against his father's chest and heard nothing. No heartbeat, no breath. Just silence, the kind of silence that swallows a 14-year-old boy whole. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, and now the man who had survived Grizzly's river crossings and 20 winters in the Rockies lay frozen stiff on a cabin floor in February of 1836. Kadak pulled the blanket over his father's face with hands that couldn't stop shaking. He was alone, and he swore right there on his knees that fire would never betray him again. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. Kadak didn't cry right away. That came later after he'd done the things that needed doing, the things his father would have expected. He pulled Griffith's body to the door, wrapped tight in the old elk hide they'd used as a ground cover since autumn. He couldn't dig a grave. The ground was frozen solid 2 feet down, and Kadak's arms were shaking from more than grief. So he dragged his father to the lean-to behind the cabin and set stones around him enough to keep the animals off until the thaw. Cadful, the half-wild dog Griffith had traded a beaver pelt for 3 years back, sat in the doorway and whined. He wouldn't go near the body. Dogs knew things. "It's just us now," Kadak said to the dog. His voice cracked on the word us. He cleared his throat and said it again, harder this time. "Just us." He went back inside and stared at the fire pit. The ashes were cold, gray, dead. He'd rebuilt this fire 1,000 times, scraped flint-fed tinder, nursed the flame the way his father had taught him. But last night the fire had burned through its fuel while they slept, and the temperature had plunged so fast that Griffith's body couldn't recover. His father had been coughing for a week and his lungs had weakened. The cold had done the rest. Kadak rebuilt the fire. He watched it catch and grow, and he hated every flicker of it. "You liar," he whispered. He sat with his back against the wall and pulled Cadful close. The dog's warmth was more honest than any flame it didn't promise to last and then quit without warning. Kadak stayed like that through the morning, feeding the fire mechanically, staring at the ceiling logs his father had notched and fitted by hand, thinking about all the conversations they'd never have again. By afternoon, he made himself eat dried venison and a handful of parched corn from the sack hanging on the rafter peg. He didn't taste any of it. He chewed because his body demanded it, and he swallowed because stopping meant dying, and he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. 3 days passed before Kadak left the cabin. The trap lines ran north along the creek for about 4 miles, then curved east toward the beaver ponds. Griffith had set 32 traps before the deep cold hit, and they needed checking. Kadak knew the route by heart. He'd walked it with his father since he was 9. But walking it alone was different. Every step felt louder. Every shadow between the trees looked like something waiting. He found 7 beaver in the first 16 traps, good pelts thick from the cold. He reset the traps the way his father had shown him. Stake angled downstream, chain-buried bait stick positioned just so. His hands moved from memory, while his mind drifted somewhere else entirely. At the 17th trap, he found the carcass of a marten that had frozen solid in the jaw of the steel. The animal's eyes were open, glazed with ice. Kadak stared at it for a long time. "That's how Pa looked," he said aloud. Then he pried the trap open and tossed the marten aside. When he got back to the cabin that evening, he hung the pelts on the stretching frames outside and fed Cadful a strip of fat. The dog ate gratefully, his tail sweeping the dirt floor. Kadak sat down and opened his father's journal. A battered leather book filled with Griffith's tight slanted handwriting. Most of it was practical. Trap counts, weather notes, pelts traded, and prices received. But near the back, Griffith had written something different. Kadak had never read these pages before. His father had been private about the journal, and Kadak had respected that. Now respect seemed less important than understanding. February 2nd. Cold broke through again last night. Fire burned down to nothing by 3 in the morning. Boy nearly froze. I held him against me until dawn. We cannot keep depending on wood and flame. The mountain does not care about our fires. It goes cold when it pleases and stays cold until it's done. There must be a better way. I have been thinking about the ground. Kadak read that last sentence 3 times. I have been thinking about the ground. He turned the page. February 5th. Spoke with Harlan Meeks at the trading post. Told him about my idea for digging below. He laughed so hard he spilled his coffee. Said I might as well dig my own grave and save the ground the trouble. Maybe he's right. But the ground stays the same temperature all year 20 feet down or so. I know this because the spring that feeds the creek never freezes even when the air is 40 below. The water comes from deep. The deep stays warm. If a man could live in the deep, the cold couldn't touch him. Kadak closed the journal. His hands were trembling again, but this time it wasn't from grief. It was from something else, something that felt almost like hope and almost like fury mixed together so tight he couldn't separate them. His father had known. Griffith had understood the danger, had seen the answer, and hadn't done anything about it. Because men like Harlan Meeks had laughed. Because the idea seemed foolish. Because digging a hole under a cabin was the kind of thing people mocked, and Griffith Pritchard, for all his toughness, had cared too much about what other trappers thought. You should have dug, Kadak said to the empty cabin. You should have dug and let them laugh. He opened the journal again looking for more, but there was nothing. Just 2 entries about the ground buried between notes about muskrat prices and the best angle for setting a deadfall. 2 entries that could have saved a life. Kadak didn't sleep that night. He sat beside the fire with Cadful across his feet, and he planned. The trading post at Willow Fork was a 12-mile walk from Kadak's cabin. He made the trip 6 days after his father's death, carrying 4 stretched beaver pelts and the marten skin. He needed supplies, a new axe head, iron spikes, and enough cornmeal to last through March. But more than supplies, he needed information. Old Thomas Wick ran the post. He was 63 years old, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a trap accident decades back, and he knew more about the mountains than any man alive. When Kadak pushed through the heavy door, Thomas looked up from behind the plank counter and studied the boy's face without speaking. Griffith, Thomas said after a moment. Kadak nodded. 6 days ago, the fire went out. Thomas exhaled slowly, the way a man does when bad news confirms what he already suspected. Sit down, son. I don't need to sit. I need to ask you something. Thomas waited. My father wrote about digging underground, a chamber below the cabin where the temperature stays steady, warm enough to survive without fire. Do you know anything about that? Thomas reached under the counter and brought out a tin cup of coffee. He set it in front of Kadak without asking if the boy wanted it. Your daddy talked to me about it once, 2 winters back. Said he figured the ground held its heat the way a root cellar holds cool in summer but deeper. He wasn't wrong about the science of it. Then why didn't he build it? Because Harlan Meeks and Ray Colton and about 6 other men told him he was out of his mind. Told him the mountain soil wouldn't hold. Told him the chamber would flood. Told him he'd waste a whole season digging and end up with nothing but a mud pit. Thomas took a sip from his own cup. Your father was a proud man, Kadak. Strong in the woods but soft when it came to opinions. Other men's words stuck in him like fishhooks. Kadak wrapped his hands around the cup. The warmth seeped into his palms. I'm going to build it. Thomas didn't laugh. He didn't shake his head. He just looked at Kadak with those pale gray eyes and said, You're 14. I know how old I am. Do you know how hard the ground is up at your cabin? You're sitting on 40 feet of clay and shale. Digging through that with a pick and shovel would break a grown man in half. Then it'll break me in half, but I'm still going to do it. Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he leaned forward. Your daddy was right about the temperature. 20 feet down the ground sits around 50 to 55 degrees no matter what's happening on the surface. You wouldn't need fire at all, just the Earth's own heat. He paused. But the men who laughed at your father will laugh at you worse. A boy doing what a man couldn't. Let them. Thomas nodded slowly. All right, let me tell you what I know about digging in rock. They talked for 2 hours. Thomas drew diagrams on the back of a hide receipt, the angle of the entrance shaft, the dimensions of the chamber, the ventilation channels that would need to run up through the cabin floor. He explained how to shore up the walls with flat stones, set in clay mortar, and how to slope the floor toward a drainage channel so groundwater wouldn't pool. He'd seen something similar in a mine shaft over near Bitterroot, he said. Different purpose, same principles. When Kadak left the trading post, he had a new axe head, a bundle of iron spikes, and a rough plan sketched on deerskin. He also had something he hadn't expected Thomas Wick's respect. Not pity, not concern, respect. The old man had looked at him the way men look at other men, not the way adults look at children. It was the first time anyone had ever done that, and Kadak carried it the whole 12 miles home. He started digging the next morning. The entrance would go through the floor of the cabin near the back wall where the ground was highest. Kadak pried up 3 of the floorboards his father had split and fitted, and he stared down at the dark earth beneath. Hard-packed clay reddish-brown, laced with pale roots from the pines outside. He picked up the shovel and drove it in. The first foot was the easiest. Loose topsoil and organic matter that came up in clumps. Below that the clay began. Dense, heavy, stubborn. Each shovelful weighed twice what the topsoil had, and the shovel blade bounced off the harder sections with a jarring clang that rattled Kadak's teeth. By midday, he'd dug down 3 feet in a space roughly 4 feet square. His palms were blistered. His back ached from the base of his spine to the top of his neck, and his shoulders burned like someone had pressed hot irons against them. He climbed out of the hole, drank water from the kettle, and went back down. Cadful sat at the edge of the opening and watched, tilting his head at the sounds coming from below. Sometimes a clod of earth flew up and hit him, and he'd yelp and back away before creeping forward again. "You could help," Kadak told him. The dog wagged his tail. By the end of the first day, Kadak had dug 4.5 feet down. He hauled the dirt up in a bucket made from a section of hollowed log, dumping it in a growing pile outside the cabin door. His hands were raw and bleeding at the base of each finger, and when he tried to make a fist, the skin cracked and wept. He wrapped strips of hide around his palms and kept going in the morning. The second day, he hit shale. The shovel was useless against it. The blade slid across the flat gray surface and threw sparks. Kadak switched to the pick, a heavy, short-handled tool that had been hanging on the cabin wall since before he was born. The first swing sent a shock through his arms that nearly made him drop it. The second swing chipped a piece of shale the size of his thumbnail. He swung the pick 400 times that day. He counted. When the light through the floorboard gap turned orange and then disappeared, he climbed out with 6 inches of shale removed and hands so swollen he couldn't hold a cup. "This is going to take forever," he said to Cadful. But he went back down in the morning, and the morning after that, and the one after that. Harlan Meeks showed up on the 9th day. Kadak heard the horse before he saw the man. He was 6 feet deep in the hole when the sound of hooves crunching through frozen ground reached him. He climbed out covered in gray dust and red clay, and found Harlan sitting on his horse just outside the cabin, looking at the pile of excavated earth with an expression that hovered between confusion and amusement. "What in God's name are you doing, boy?" "Digging. I can see that. Digging for what? Gold? Shelter." Harlan dismounted and walked closer. He was a big man, wide through the chest, with a beard that covered most of his face and small calculating eyes. He'd been trapping these mountains for 20 years and considered himself the authority on how things were done. "Thomas told me about your project." He said the word project the way someone might say disease. "Said you were digging an underground room." "A chamber, below the cabin." Harlan looked at the hole, then back at Kadak. "Your daddy talked about this same foolishness. I told him it wouldn't work, and I'll tell you the same. The ground up here is clay and rock. You dig a chamber in that, and the first heavy rain will collapse it on your head. You'll bury yourself alive. I'm lining it with stone." "Stone." Harlan laughed. It was a hard barking sound. "Where are you getting stone? You going to carry it up the mountain on your back?" "There's a slide field half a mile east. Flat shale in slabs. I've already started moving some." Harlan shook his head. "Boy, listen to me. Your father was a good man, but he had ideas that didn't match reality. This is one of them. You'd be better off building a proper fireplace with a reflector wall. Double your wood supply. Seal the cabin tighter. That's how you survive winter up here. Not by digging into the ground like a badger. Fire killed my father. The words landed hard. Harlan's expression shifted not to sympathy exactly, but to something more uncomfortable. He knew the truth of it. Everyone at Willow Fork knew how Griffith had died. Fire didn't kill your father, Harlan said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Cold killed him. Fire just wasn't enough. That's the same thing, and it's why I'm not depending on it anymore. Harlan stared at the boy for a long moment, then mounted his horse. You'll waste the whole spring and summer on this, and when winter comes, you'll climb down into your mud hole and freeze just like your daddy did. I've seen men try to outsmart these mountains. The mountains always win. My father didn't try to outsmart the mountain. He listened to men like you instead. Harlan's face darkened. He yanked the reins and turned his horse without another word. Kadak watched him ride until he disappeared into the tree line. Then he lowered himself back into the hole and picked up the pick. The shale cracked under his next swing, and a slab the size of a dinner plate broke free. It was the largest single piece he'd removed yet. He set it aside carefully. It would be perfect for the wall lining. That felt good, he said to no one in particular. Cadful barked once from above as if agreeing. By the end of March, the hole was 9 feet deep, and Kadak had begun widening the base to form the chamber. The shape was roughly oval, 8 feet long, and 6 feet across at the widest point. He'd lined the first 3 feet of the walls with flat shale pieces, set in a mortar of clay, mixed with pine pitch, pressed tight and smoothed until the surface was nearly even. The work was painstaking. Each stone had to be fitted against its neighbors, and the mortar had to cure slowly near a small fire he kept burning at the bottom of the shaft. The temperature down there was already different. At 9 feet, the air was noticeably warmer than the surface even on cold days. Kadak pressed his hand flat against the unlined earth at the bottom and felt a coolness that was steady, unchanging, indifferent to the wind howling through the trees above. Not warm exactly, but not cold either. Stable, reliable. Everything fire wasn't. He'd developed a routine. Mornings he checked and reset traps. Afternoons he dug. Evenings he carried stone from the slide field, loading flat slabs into a crude sled he'd built from pine poles and dragging them uphill with a rope over his shoulder. At night he sat by the fire he still needed for now, and read his father's journal, searching for any other clues Griffith might have left behind. He found one on April 3rd. It was a single line written in the margin beside a note about beaver prices. Talk to Samuel Crow. He built something under his place near the flathead. Lives in it all winter. Samuel Crow. Kadak had heard the name, but never met the man. A half-Crow, half-French trapper who ran lines north of the divide. Considered eccentric by the other mountain men, which usually meant he had ideas they didn't understand. Kadak decided to find him. It took 3 days of travel, sleeping rough with Cadful pressed against him for warmth, before Kadak reached the settlement near Flathead Lake. He asked at the trading post there, and the clerk, a woman named Marjorie Dalton, with a no-nonsense voice and ink-stained fingers, told him Samuel Crow lived 4 miles east along the river. He doesn't take kindly to visitors, she warned. I'm not visiting, I'm learning. Marjorie studied him. Whose boy are you? Griffith Pritchard's. Her face softened slightly. I heard about Griffith. I'm sorry. She paused. Samuel's cabin is past the second bend in the river. Look for smoke. If there's no smoke, he's underground. Kadak found the cabin. There was no smoke. He circled the structure, looking for the entrance to whatever lay beneath. Cadful found it first, a wooden hatch set into the ground 15 feet behind the cabin, covered with a layer of packed earth and dead grass. The dog scratched at it and whined. Hello? Kadak called out. Mr. Crow, my name's Kadak Pritchard. I came to talk to you about your underground shelter. Silence. Then from beneath the ground, a muffled voice. Go away. I can't do that, sir. I walked 3 days to get here. More silence. Then the hatch creaked open from below, and a face appeared, weathered, dark-eyed, framed by long black hair streaked with gray. Samuel Crow looked at Kadak the way a man looks at a puzzle he didn't ask to solve. Pritchard, Griffith's boy. Yes, sir? Griffith's dead. Yes, sir. The fire went out. Samuel stared at him for a long moment, then pushed the hatch open wider. Come down. Kadak descended a set of rough-hewn steps into a space that made him stop breathing. The chamber was enormous, 12 feet across, with walls lined in smooth river stone and a ceiling braced with thick pine beams. The floor was packed earth-dry and firm. 2 oil lamps burned on ledges cut into the walls, casting steady yellow light. And the temperature, Kadak felt it immediately, was warm. Not hot, not stuffy, just warm. Comfortable. Like a mild autumn afternoon buried 20 feet beneath frozen ground. 54 degrees, Samuel said, watching the boy's face. All winter, all summer. Never changes more than a degree either way. You live down here. November through March, sometimes April if the cold hangs on. Up top is for summer and autumn. Down here is for surviving. Samuel sat on a bench carved from a single log. Your father talked to me about this 2 years ago, said he wanted to build one. He never did. I know. He told me the others laughed at him, told me he felt foolish. Samuel's voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Your father died because he cared more about their laughter than about the earth under his feet. The words hit Kadak like a fist. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He'd been circling that truth for weeks, and hearing someone else say it aloud made it real in a way he hadn't been ready for. I'm building one, Kadak said. I've already dug 9 feet. Samuel looked at him with those dark, unreadable eyes. 9 feet in that clay and shale up at your place? Yes, sir. By yourself? Yes, sir. Just me and my dog. Samuel Crow did something Kadak didn't expect. He smiled. It was a small private smile, the kind a man makes when something confirms what he already believed about the world. Stay the night, Samuel said. I'll teach you everything I know. And when you go back, you'll finish that chamber right, and you'll never need fire to keep you alive again. Kadak sank down onto the packed earth floor of Samuel Crow's underground chamber, and for the first time in weeks, the knot in his chest loosened. Cadful padded down the steps, sniffed every corner of the room, and curled up at Kadak's feet with a long, satisfied sigh. The earth held them both steady and sure, while the wind screamed across the frozen surface above and found nothing to kill. Samuel Crow talked through the night. Not the way men at the trading post talked, boasting, circling, filling silence with noise. Samuel spoke the way a man lays stone, one piece at a time, fitted precisely, nothing wasted. He explained how he'd spent 2 full summers digging his chamber, how he'd learned through failure that the walls needed to curve inward slightly at the top to distribute the weight of the earth above, how a flat ceiling would collapse within a year, but an arched one could hold for decades. He showed Kadak the ventilation shaft's 2 narrow channels bored upward through the soil at opposite ends of the chamber, lined with hollowed pine logs to keep the earth from caving in. One drew air down, the other pushed stale air up. The draft was so gentle, Kadak couldn't feel it on his skin, but when Samuel held a feather near the intake shaft, it fluttered steadily. Most men who try to build underground make the same mistake, Samuel said. They think about keeping the cold out. That's wrong. The cold is already out. 20 feet of earth does that work for you. What you need to think about is keeping the air alive. A sealed chamber will suffocate you before the cold ever gets a chance. Kadak absorbed every word. He asked questions, practical, specific, stripped of anything unnecessary. How thick should the stone lining be? At least 8 inches, preferably 12 where the soil was soft. How deep before the temperature stabilized? 15 feet was adequate, but 20 was safer. What about water seepage? Slope the floor toward a sump pit at the lowest corner, and bail it when needed. In Samuel's chamber, he bailed twice a week in spring, hardly at all the rest of the year. What about the entrance? Kadak asked. Mine goes straight down through the cabin floor. Yours is separate behind the cabin. That's deliberate, Samuel said. If your cabin catches fire, You don't want your only way out blocked by burning timber falling into the shaft. Build a second entrance, always. A man with one exit is a man who's already half-trapped. Kadak hadn't thought of that. The realization hit him with a cold clarity. He'd been so focused on getting down into the earth that he hadn't considered what might prevent him from getting back up. His father had died because of a single point of failure. The fire went out and there was no backup. Kadak was building a backup for the fire, but the backup itself had no backup. One entrance, one way in, one way out. That was the same mistake, just deeper underground. "I'll dig a second shaft," he said. Samuel nodded. "Good. Now let me show you something else." He led Kadak to the far wall of the chamber where a shallow alcove had been cut into the stone. Inside it sat a clay pot filled with water. Samuel dipped his hand in. "Feel." Kadak reached in. The water was warm. Not hot, just warm, like water that had been sitting in the sun for an hour. "That seeps in from the ground," Samuel said. "Naturally warm. The earth heats it. In the dead of winter, when everything above is frozen solid, this water stays 50-some degrees. You can drink it. You can wash with it. You can press warm cloths against your body if you start to chill." He paused. "The mountain isn't your enemy, Kadak. The mountain is offering you everything you need. Most men are too proud or too stupid to accept the offer." They slept a few hours before dawn, stretched out on beds of pine boughs that Samuel had layered thick on raised wooden platforms. Kadak lay in the warm, still air and listened to the absolute silence. No wind, no creak of timber, no snap of a dying fire making him jerk awake, heart-pounding, wondering if the flame had gone out again. Just silence and warmth, and the faint drip of water finding its way through stone. He left at first light. Samuel walked him to the hatch and handed him a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Tools," he said. "A star drill for splitting shale, and a hand auger for boring your ventilation shafts. I don't need them anymore. I can't pay you for these. I didn't ask you to." Samuel looked down at Cadful, who was wagging his tail against the frozen ground. "You've got a long walk, boy, and a longer dig. Don't let anyone talk you out of it." "Nobody could. Your father said the same thing once. Then Harlan Meeks opened his mouth and your father put down his shovel." Samuel's eyes were steady, unblinking. "Don't be your father." The words should have stung. Maybe they were meant to. But Kadak heard something else beneath them. Not cruelty, but warning. A gift disguised as a blade. "I won't," he said. He turned south with a Cadful at his heels and walked for 3 days through snow and silence and the bitter tail end of winter. And when he reached his cabin, he didn't even go inside. He walked straight to the hole in the floor, lowered himself down, and started swinging the star drill into the shale. The sound rang through the empty cabin like a bell. Spring came in fits and starts, a warm day, followed by 2 freezing ones, snowmelt running in muddy channels down the slope, then fresh snow covering everything white again. Kadak worked through all of it. He'd developed a system, now informed by everything Samuel had taught him. He drilled a line of holes across the shale face, then hammered iron wedges into each hole until the rock split along the line. The slabs that broke free became wall stones. Nothing was wasted. By mid-April, the shaft was 14 feet deep, and the chamber walls were taking shape. The oval room was growing 8 feet by 6, with the beginnings of the arched ceiling that Samuel had described. Kadak fitted the stones carefully, wedging each one against its neighbor and packing clay mortar into every gap. When a stone didn't fit, he chipped it with the axe until it did. When the mortar crumbled, he mixed a new batch with more pine pitch and tried again. His hands had changed. The blisters from the first week had hardened into calluses as thick as boot leather. His forearms were corded with muscle he hadn't had before. His shoulders had broadened from hauling stone and swinging the pick, and his grip had become the grip of a man twice his age. When he caught his reflection in the water bucket one morning, he barely recognized himself. The boy who'd knelt beside his father's body in February was gone. Someone harder had taken his place, but the loneliness hadn't hardened. That stayed raw. He talked to Cadful, constantly narrating his work, asking the dog's opinion on stone placement, arguing with him about whether the ventilation shaft should angle east or north. Cadful never answered, of course, but his presence was enough. A heartbeat in the cabin, a warm body at night. Proof that Kadak wasn't the last living creature on the mountain. In late April, he made his second trip to Willow Fork for supplies. Thomas Wick met him at the counter with the same calm, appraising look. "How deep?" 14 feet. The chamber's roughed in. I'm lining the walls now." Thomas whistled softly. 14 feet in that ground. By yourself. Samuel Crow gave me tools. A star drill and an auger. They made the difference. You found Samuel. 3-day walk. He showed me his chamber, taught me about ventilation and drainage and the arch ceiling. Kadak set his pelts on the counter, 12 beaver, 6 marten, 2 fox. A good haul for a boy running lines alone. He told me not to be my father. Thomas flinched at that just slightly. Samuel doesn't soften his words much. He doesn't need to, he's right. Thomas weighed the pelts and credited Kadak's account. Then he leaned on the counter with both elbows, the way he did when something serious was coming. "Harlan Meeks has been talking about you." Kadak felt his jaw tighten. "Saying what?" "Saying you're a foolish boy wasting your time. Saying the chamber will flood or collapse. Saying you'll come crawling to the settlement before next winter, begging for a place by someone else's fire." Thomas paused. "He's also saying you're disrespecting your father's memory by taking up the same fool idea that Griffith had the good sense to abandon." Something hot and dangerous moved through Kadak's chest. He set both hands flat on the counter and pressed down until the wood creaked. "My father abandoned that idea because of Harlan. And then my father died. Harlan knows that. He knows his laughter killed Griffith Pritchard just as sure as the cold did." Kadak. "And if Harlan Meeks comes to my cabin again, I'll tell him that to his face." Thomas studied the boy, the set of his jaw, the flatness in his eyes, the hands pressed hard against the wood. He'd seen that look before in men who'd been pushed past the place where reason governed. It worried him. "Don't make this about Harlan," Thomas said quietly. "Make it about the chamber. Make it about surviving. The minute you start digging to prove a man wrong, instead of to keep yourself alive, you've lost the purpose of the thing." Kadak held the old man's gaze for a long moment. Then the tension in his hands eased, and he pulled them back from the counter. "You're right," he said. "I know you're right. Go home, dig, line the walls, build your ventilation, and when winter comes, you climb down into that chamber and you live. That's the answer to Harlan Meeks. Not words, living." Kadak loaded his supplies onto the pack frame and headed for the door. He was halfway through it when Thomas called after him. "Kadak?" He turned. "Your father would be proud of you. I want you to know that." Kadak's throat closed. He nodded once sharply and walked out before the old man could see his eyes. The walk home took the rest of the day. Cadful ranged ahead and behind, chasing squirrels into the timber and circling back with his tongue, hanging happy for the exercise after days cooped up in the cabin. Kadak walked steadily, the pack frame biting into his shoulders, his mind turning over Thomas's warning like a stone in a creek. Make it about the chamber, not about Harlan. He knew the old man was wise. He knew anger was a poor foundation for anything. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face gray, still frozen, and behind that face he heard Harlan Meeks laughing. The two things were tangled together in a knot he couldn't undo and maybe didn't want to. He reached the cabin at dusk and found something that stopped him cold. The pile of excavated earth outside the door had been scattered. Not by wind or animals, the marks in the dirt were boot prints, heavy ones from a large man's boots. And on the cabin door, scratched deep into the wood with a knife point, were 2 words, "Dig deeper." Kadak stared at the words. His first thought was Harlan. His second thought was that it didn't matter who. The words were meant as mockery, but Kadak read them differently. He ran his fingers over the carved letters and felt the ridges of the cuts. "I will," he said. He opened the door, lit the fire, and fed Cadful. Then he sat beside the hole in the floor and looked down into the darkness of his unfinished chamber. 14 feet of effort. Months of pain. And still so much left to do. The walls needed finishing. The ceiling arch needed completion. The ventilation shafts needed boring. The second entrance, Samuel's insistence, hadn't even been started, and summer was coming. The trapping season would slow, pelts would thin, and income would drop. He'd need to hunt for meat, dry it for winter stores, gather firewood, even though he hoped not to need it. Every day spent on one task was a day stolen from another. "I can do this," he said aloud. Cadfael looked at him with amber eyes that reflected the firelight. "I have to do this." He lowered himself into the hole and started working by the light of a tallow candle jammed into a crack in the wall. The star drill rang against the rock, and the sound echoed up through the cabin and out through the logs and into the dark, empty forest where nobody heard it. Nobody except the mountain. And the mountain, as Samuel Crow had said, was not his enemy. May brought warmth and with it a surge of energy that Kadak hadn't expected. The longer days gave him more working hours, and the softening ground above made the second entrance possible. He chose a spot 8 feet behind the cabin on a slight rise, where rainwater would drain away rather than toward the shaft. The digging was faster here. The first 5 feet were loose glacial soil, rocky but manageable. Below that, the familiar clay and shale resumed, but Kadak attacked it with a confidence he hadn't possessed in February. His technique was better now. His arms were stronger. His patience had deepened into something that resembled faith. By the end of May, the second shaft was 8 feet deep and angling toward the main chamber. He calculated that another 6 feet of lateral tunneling would connect the two. The tunnel would be narrow, just wide enough to crawl through, but it would serve its purpose. A way out. A backup for the backup. He was in the second shaft on a Thursday afternoon when he heard voices above. Not one voice, several. He climbed out, blinking in the sunlight, and found 4 men standing near the cabin. Harlan Meeks was one of them. The others were Ray Colton, a wiry trapper with a pinched face and a perpetual squint. Jedediah Hall, big and slow-moving, who followed Harlan the way Cadfael followed Kadak, and a man Kadak didn't recognize, younger, maybe 25, with clean hands that hadn't seen a trap line in months. "Well," Harlan said, surveying the twin mounds of excavated earth flanking the cabin. "You've been busy." Kadak said nothing. He set the pick down slowly, deliberately, and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Heard you went to see Samuel Crow." Harlan continued. "That half-breed's crazier than a rabid coon, living underground like a mole. And now you're doing the same." He shook his head. "Griffith would be ashamed." "Don't talk about my father. I'll talk about whoever I please, boy. Griffith was my friend." Friends don't laugh when a man has an idea that could save his life. The words landed hard. Ray Colton shifted his weight and looked away. Jedediah studied his boots. The stranger watched with sharp, interested eyes. Only Harlan held steady, but Kadak saw the muscle jump in his jaw. "Your daddy's idea was a hole in the ground. My idea was a better fireplace. He chose wrong. He didn't choose at all. You made the choice for him." Harlan stepped closer. He was a head taller than Kadak and outweighed him by 80 pounds. "You blaming me for your father's death?" Kadak didn't step back. He looked up into Harlan's face and held the man's gaze with a steadiness that surprised them both. "I'm blaming the fire that went out. And I'm blaming the fact that there was nothing else to keep him alive when it did. There should have been. He knew it. You talked him out of it." Harlan's fists clenched at his sides. For a long, dangerous moment, Kadak thought the man was going to hit him. He braced for it, planted his feet, tightened his core, locked his jaw. If Harlan swung, Kadak would take the blow and get back up. He'd gotten good at getting back up. But Harlan didn't swing. Something in the boy's eyes stopped him. Not anger, not defiance, but certainty. The look of someone who has already decided how this ends and isn't afraid of the middle part. "You're wasting your time," Harlan said, but his voice had softened to something closer to resignation than contempt. He turned to the others. "Let's go." Ray and Jedediah followed without a word. But the stranger lingered. He looked at the excavated earth, then at the hole behind the cabin, then at Kadak. "How deep is the main chamber?" he asked. 14 feet, arched ceiling, stone-lined walls, 2 ventilation shafts. The man raised his eyebrows. "You did all this alone?" "Yes." He extended his hand. "I'm Peter Lowell. I just arrived from St. Louis. I'm not a trapper. I'm a surveyor for the American Fur Company. I've seen mine shafts and root cellars all across the territory, but I've never seen someone your age build an underground survival chamber." He paused. "Can I look at it?" Kadak hesitated. Then he nodded. He led Peter to the main shaft inside the cabin and watched the man lower himself carefully down the rough-cut steps. Peter moved slowly, examining the stone walls, running his fingers along the mortar joints, testing the firmness of the arch overhead. When he reached the bottom of the chamber, he stood still for a full minute, breathing the air, feeling the temperature. 53 degrees, Kadak said from above. Peter looked up. "You measured it." "I have a thermometer. It was my father's." Peter climbed back up with a thoughtful expression that Kadak couldn't read. He brushed clay from his coat and stood in the cabin looking around at the tools, the pelts, the rough furniture, the dog sleeping in the corner. "You're 14 years old," Peter said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. And you designed this based on what your father's notes and a visit to Samuel Crow, and common sense. The earth doesn't change temperature. Fire does. I chose the thing that doesn't change." Peter Lowell looked at Kadak Pritchard the way Thomas Wick had, not as a man looks at a boy, but as a man looks at an equal whose work demands respect. "When you finish this," Peter said, "I want to document it. Measurements, diagrams, temperature readings through the winter. The company needs to know about this. There are men dying every winter in these mountains because they trust fire and nothing else. First, I have to finish it." "How long?" Kadak did the math in his head. The ceiling arch needed another 3 weeks. The ventilation shafts needed boring and lining 2 weeks each. The connecting tunnel between the 2 entrances would take another month. The floor drainage had to be dug and the sump pit excavated. Storage alcoves for food and water. Sleeping platforms. "September," he said, "if nothing goes wrong." "And if something does?" Kadak picked up the star drill and tested its weight in his hand. The steel was warm from the sun, and the handle was smooth from months of use. "Then I'll fix it and keep going." Peter nodded. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather case. Inside was a compass, a folding ruler, and a set of drafting pencils. "Take these. When you finish each section, measure it and sketch it. Length, width, depth, stone thickness, mortar, composition, air temperature at different levels. Write everything down. If this works, and I believe it will, it needs to be repeatable. Other men need to be able to build what you've built." Kadak took the case. It was heavier than it looked. Not in weight, in meaning. "Thank you," he said. Peter Lowell shook his hand again and walked out of the cabin. Kadak watched him mount his horse and ride west toward the trail that led to Willow Fork, and he stood there in the doorway, holding the leather case against his chest, until horse and rider disappeared. Then he went back underground. The star drill bit into the shale, and a piece of rock the size of his fist broke free and fell to the chamber floor. Kadak picked it up, turned it over, and set it on the growing pile of wallstones. Cadfael appeared at the top of the shaft, peered down, and wagged his tail once before settling onto the cabin floor to wait. The afternoon light slanted through the gap in the floorboards, illuminating the dust that swirled in the chamber air. Kadak swung the drill again. And again, and again. Each strike sent vibrations through his arms and into his shoulders and down through his spine, and each strike brought the finished chamber 1/fraction of an inch closer to reality. He thought about what Peter had said. If this works, it needs to be repeatable. Other men, other cabins, other winters. His father's idea dismissed and buried and now resurrected by a 14-year-old boy with bleeding hands and a dead man's journal might save lives that hadn't even been born yet. The weight of that settled onto Kadak's shoulders alongside the weight of the stone and the clay and the grief, and he bore all of it, because bearing weight was what he did now. It was what the mountain had taught him, not how to stay warm, but how to carry what was heavy and keep moving. He swung the drill until the candle burned to a stub, and the darkness swallowed everything except the sound of steel against stone, steady and relentless, echoing up through 14 feet of earth and into a cabin where a dog slept and a fire burned, and the ghost of a dead trapper watched his son become something the mountain couldn't kill. June nearly killed him. Not the cold that was gone, now replaced by heat that pressed down on the mountain like a hand. Not the work his body had adapted to the daily punishment of pick and drill and stone. What nearly killed Kadak Pritchard in June of 1836 was the tunnel. He'd been digging the lateral connection between the main chamber and the second entrance shaft for 11 days when the cave-in happened. He was on his belly in a crawl space barely wide enough for his shoulders, chipping at the shale face with the star drill, when he heard a sound above him. Not a crack, not a snap, but a low grinding moan, the sound of earth shifting against itself. He had exactly enough time to flatten his face against the ground before 300 pounds of clay and loose rock collapsed onto his back. The weight drove the air out of his lungs. His mouth filled with dirt. He couldn't move his arms. They were pinned at his sides by the debris, and his legs were buried from the knees down. Total darkness. Absolute silence, except for the frantic hammering of his own heartbeat and the muffled, distant barking of Cadful somewhere above. Kadak's first thought was clear and cold. I'm going to die in this tunnel. His second thought, arriving less than a heartbeat later, was equally clear. No, I'm not. He spat the dirt from his mouth and forced himself to breathe through his nose. Small breaths. Controlled. The weight on his back was enormous, but not crushing the shale slab that had fallen, had landed at an angle propped partially against the tunnel wall, creating a narrow pocket of space above his spine. If that slab shifted even 2 inches, it would flatten him. But for now, it held. He worked his right hand free first. The effort took what felt like an hour, but was probably 10 minutes. He clawed at the loose clay beside his ribcage, scooping it backward inch by inch until his elbow could bend. Then his forearm, then his hand. He reached forward and found empty space. The tunnel ahead was still clear. The collapse had happened behind him between his body and the second entrance shaft. His left hand came free next. Then, with both arms extended forward, he pulled. The debris resisted. His legs were still buried, and the weight on his back pressed him into the ground like a vice. He pulled harder, digging his fingers into the shale floor, dragging himself forward a fraction of an inch at a time. The rock on his back scraped along his spine, tearing through his shirt and into his skin. He felt the warmth of blood, but didn't stop. 1 inch, 2, 3. His knees cleared the debris pile. His feet. He crawled forward into the open tunnel, gasping, shaking, bleeding from a dozen cuts along his back and arms. He lay face down in the darkness for a long time, breathing. Then he crawled forward to the main chamber and pulled himself up the entrance shaft hand over hand, until he emerged through the cabin floor into daylight and collapsed on the rough wood with Cadful licking his face and whining. "I'm all right," he told the dog. His voice was raw, scraped hollow. "I'm all right." He wasn't all right. His back was a mess of torn skin and embedded grit. His ribs ached where the weight had compressed them, and when he breathed deeply, a sharp pain lanced through his left side that might have been a cracked rib or might have been bruised muscle. He couldn't tell, and it didn't matter. Both would heal. What mattered was the tunnel. The collapse meant the soil in that section was unstable, looser than the clay and shale elsewhere, probably a pocket of glacial till mixed with decomposed granite. Samuel had warned him about this. The mountain isn't uniform. You'll hit soft spots. When you do, shore them up before you dig through them, or the mountain will bury you and not think twice about it. Kadak had dug through the soft spot without shoring it. He'd been impatient. He'd been rushing to connect the 2 shafts before the summer heat made the tunnel work unbearable. And the mountain had reminded him with 300 pounds of earth on his back that impatience underground was the same thing as death. He spent 2 days on the surface recovering. He cleaned his wounds with water heated over the fire, packed the deeper cuts with pine pitch the way his father had taught him, and wrapped his torso with strips of cloth torn from an old shirt. The pain in his ribs faded from sharp to dull by the second morning. He could breathe without wincing. He could swing his arms, He could work. On the third day, he went back into the tunnel. This time he moved slowly. He brought the hand auger and 4 pine poles he'd cut and peeled, each one 6 feet long and thick as his wrist. At the collapse site, he cleared the fallen debris, handful by handful, stacking it behind him. When the section was open again, he set the pine poles vertically against the walls and braced them with cross pieces wedged tight. Then he packed clay around the bases and tamped it firm. The shoring held. He tested it by pressing his full weight against each pole, then by striking the tunnel wall beside them with the pick. The earth trembled but stayed put. The poles flexed but didn't shift. "Good enough," he said. He dug through the remaining 4 feet of lateral tunnel in 3 days, shoring every foot as he went. When his drill broke through the wall of the second entrance shaft, a rush of cool air hit his face, and he closed his eyes and breathed it in like a man surfacing from underwater. The chamber had 2 entrances now, 2 ways in, 2 ways out. His father had died with no backup. Kadak would not. He climbed out of the second shaft and stood behind his cabin, looking at the 2 mounds of earth, the cabin between them, the forest beyond. Cadful sat beside him, panting in the June heat. "We're halfway done," Kadak said. The dog looked up at him with complete trust. "Maybe more than halfway. Maybe." He went inside to eat and found that his cornmeal was nearly gone. The dried venison was holding, but he needed fresh meat and he needed to check the traps he'd been neglecting during the tunnel work. The balance between building and surviving was a razor's edge. Every day underground was a day. He wasn't hunting, wasn't trapping, wasn't preparing the food stores he'd need for winter. The chamber would keep him warm, but it wouldn't feed him. He ran the trap lines the next morning and found them mostly empty. 2 beaver, both thin-pelted and not worth stretching. The spring melt had shifted the creek channels, and his sets were in the wrong positions. He'd need to resurvey the lines, find the new channels, and reset everything. That was a week's work minimum. "I don't have a week," he said to Cadful. But he didn't have a choice either. He spent 5 days resetting the traps, relocating 6 of them to new positions along the shifted creek, and snaring 3 rabbits and a grouse for immediate eating. The fresh meat tasted so good after months of dried venison that he almost wept. He cooked the grouse over the fire, shared the giblets with Cadful, and ate every scrap of flesh down to the bones. While checking the easternmost trapline, he found fresh tracks that made his stomach tighten. Grizzly. A big one, judging by the width of the prints. The tracks followed the creek for a 1/4 mile, then veered uphill toward the ridge, toward his cabin. Kadak checked his rifle. His father's Hawken, a .50 caliber percussion cap that Griffith had carried for 15 years. Kadak had fired it dozens of times, but never at a grizzly. He hoped he wouldn't have to. He didn't see the bear that day or the next, but the tracks appeared again 4 days later, closer to the cabin. Cadful smelled something that night and wouldn't stop growling at the door. His hackles raised, his teeth bared. Kadak sat up with the Hawken across his knees and waited until dawn. In the morning he found claw marks on the lean-to where his father's body had been. The stones he'd piled in February were scattered. The elk hide was torn. The body was gone. Kadak stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where Griffith Pritchard had lain for 4 months. The bear had taken his father's remains, and there was nothing left. No bones, no cloth, no trace. Just claw marks in the wood and scattered stones. He should have buried him properly. He should have found a way, built a fire on the frozen ground to soften it, dug a shallow grave, covered it with heavy stone. He'd told himself the ground was too hard, that spring would come soon enough, that the lean-to was sufficient. But it hadn't been sufficient. Nothing about that February morning had been sufficient. "I'm sorry, Pa," he said. Cadful pressed against his leg. Kadak gathered the scattered stones and stacked them in a rough cairn where the body had been. He placed his father's skinning knife on top, the one with the antler handle that Griffith had carried since before Kadak was born. It was a good knife, and giving it up hurt, but it felt right. A marker, an offering, something to say. You were here, you mattered. He went back to work. July came fast and brutal. The heat inside the tunnel was suffocating, and Kadak learned to work in the early morning and late evening, resting during the worst of the afternoon. He spent those rest hours on the ventilation shafts, boring upward through the chamber ceiling, with the hand auger a slow, exhausting process that required him to stand on a makeshift platform of stacked stones and push the auger overhead until his arms went numb. The first shaft broke through to the surface on July 14th. Kadak heard the whistle of air moving through the narrow bore, and he felt the draft on his upturned face, a faint, steady pull of fresh air descending into the chamber. He plugged the surface end with a wooden cap that could be opened and closed, and he lined the bore with sections of hollowed pine, just as Samuel had described. The second ventilation shaft took another week. When both were operational, the air quality in the chamber transformed. The staleness vanished. The faint smell of damp earth remained, but it was clean now. Living air circulating through a living space. Kadak spent an hour sitting in the chamber with his eyes closed, breathing, feeling the steady 53-degree temperature on his skin, and he thought, this is going to work. He was boring a storage alcove into the chamber wall on August 2nd, when Peter Lowell returned. Kadak heard the horse and climbed out, expecting trouble, Harlan maybe, or another round of mockery from the trapping community. Instead, he found Peter dismounting near the cabin with a leather satchel over one shoulder and a look of barely contained excitement. "I brought someone," Peter said. "I hope you don't mind." A second horse emerged from the tree line carrying a woman. She was perhaps 40, lean and weather-hardened, with her hair pulled back in a tight bun and clothing that was practical rather than fashionable. Men's trousers, a heavy cotton shirt, boots worn soft at the soles. She dismounted with the ease of someone who'd spent more of her life on horseback than off it. "This is Dr. Eleanor Voss," Peter said. "She's a geologist with the Army Corps of Topographical Engineers. She's been surveying mineral deposits along the Missouri, and when I told her what you'd built, she insisted on seeing it." Dr. Voss extended her hand. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused. "Mr. Pritchard." "I'm 14, Kadak said, because it seemed important to say. "I'm aware. That's precisely why I'm here." She looked at the excavated earth mounds, the two entrance shafts, the cabin between them. "May I go down?" He led her to the main shaft. She descended carefully, one hand on the wall, and when she reached the chamber floor, she stood still, the way Peter had, absorbing the temperature, the air, the dimensions. But where Peter had reacted with surprise, Dr. Voss reacted with the focused intensity of someone confirming a hypothesis. "You're at approximately 20 feet below grade 19. The last foot is drainage slope toward the sump. Stone lining thickness 10 to 12 inches. Flat shale in clay and pitch mortar. Arch ratio." Kadak didn't know the term, but he understood the question. "The ceiling curves up about 2 feet from the top of the walls. The highest point is 3 feet above my head when I stand in the center." Dr. Voss ran her hand along the ceiling stones, pressing at joints, testing for movement. Nothing shifted. She examined the ventilation shafts, the drainage channel, the beginning of the storage alcove. She pulled a small thermometer from her satchel and held it in the center of the chamber for 2 minutes. 53.4 degrees Fahrenheit, she said, consistent with predicted geothermal gradient for this elevation and latitude. She looked up at Kadak, who was watching from the shaft above. "Come down here. I want to talk to you." He descended. They stood facing each other in the chamber, a 14-year-old boy and a woman who had studied the earth professionally for 2 decades. "Who taught you to arch the ceiling?" she asked. "Samuel Crow. The method is sound. Better than sound, it's elegant. The curve distributes load radially the way a bridge arch works. If you'd used a flat ceiling, the span would have collapsed under the soil weight within a year. At 12 inches of stone lining, you've got approximately 2,000 pounds per square foot of compressive strength. The shale is ideal. It's a natural laminate that resists shear better than most building stone." She paused. "Did you understand any of that?" "I understood that it won't fall on my head." Dr. Voss smiled. It transformed her face from severe to almost kind. "That's the essential point, yes." She spent 3 hours in and around the chamber. She measured everything: wall thickness, shaft diameter, tunnel dimensions, ceiling height at 12 different points. She sketched cross-sections in a notebook with the same kind of drafting pencils Peter had given Kadak. She tested the mortar with a knife blade, noted the composition, and scraped samples into small glass vials. When she climbed out for the last time, she sat on a log beside the cabin and looked at Kadak with an expression he couldn't quite read. "There are engineers in Washington who would struggle to build what you've built," she said. "Men with formal training, proper equipment teams of workers. You did this alone with hand tools at 14 years old in ground that would defeat most excavation efforts." She closed her notebook. "I'm going to include your chamber in my survey report to the Corps, with your permission." What does that mean? It means that military engineers and frontier planners will read about what you've done. It means that when the Army builds outposts in these mountains, and they'll consider underground construction as a survival strategy. Your chamber could become a model. Kadak absorbed this. The idea that something he'd built with bleeding hands and a dead man's tools could matter beyond his own survival was so large he couldn't hold it all at once. He held a piece of it, the piece that connected to his father. "Put my father's name on it," he said. "Griffith Pritchard." It was his idea first. Dr. Voss studied the boy's face. Then she opened her notebook and wrote the name at the top of the page, underlined it, and showed it to him. "Griffith Pritchard," she read aloud. "Originator. Kadak Pritchard Builder." She paused. "Is that acceptable?" Kadak's throat tightened the way it had in Thomas Wick's trading post, the way it did every time someone acknowledged what his father had been and what his father had lost. He nodded once and turned away before his composure broke. Peter and Dr. Voss left the next morning. Kadak watched them ride west and then went underground immediately, because the chamber was the one place where his grief could exist alongside his purpose, without one destroying the other. Down there, 19 feet below the surface, with the steady temperature holding him and the earth pressing gently on all sides, he could miss his father without falling apart. He could feel the loss and still work. The two things coexisted in the cool, still air, the way they couldn't coexist anywhere else. He finished the storage alcove that day. He carved it deep, 4 feet into the wall, 3 feet wide, arched at the top like the ceiling. It would hold enough dried meat and cornmeal to last 2 months underground if necessary. He started a second alcove on the opposite wall for water storage, clay pots, sealed with beeswax filled from the spring-fed seep that wept through the lower stones. August burned away. Kadak worked with a fury that bordered on obsession. The sleeping platform went in raised pine poles covered with layers of spruce boughs and elk hide, positioned near the south wall where the natural warmth was strongest. A small shelf cut into the stone held the tallow candles and his father's journal. A hook pounded into a ceiling beam held the Hawken oiled and loaded within arm's reach. He tested the chamber overnight for the first time on August 28th. He sealed both entrance hatches, lit a single candle, and lay on the sleeping platform with Cadful beside him. The temperature held at 53 degrees. The ventilation shafts moved air so quietly he had to press his ear against the bore to hear it. The silence was complete. No wind, no animal sounds, no crack of branches. Just the faint drip of water from the seep and the beating of his own heart. He slept deeper than he had since February. No dreams, no jolting awake to check the fire. No fear. When he climbed out in the morning, the August sun hit his face, and he blinked against it like a man emerging from a different world. Cadful bounded out behind him and rolled in the dirt, kicking his legs in the air. Kadak looked at the cabin. He looked at the forest. He looked at the sky, where clouds were already building from the west in the pattern that meant autumn was coming. "Let them come," he said. "Every storm, every cold front, every 40 below night." He ran his hand along the edge of the entrance hatch, feeling the solid wood, the tight fit. Let them all come. He had 1 month before the first frost. 1 month to finish the food store's stack emergency firewood in the cabin above, seal every gap in the hatch covers, and prepare for the winter that would test everything he'd built, everything he'd bled for, everything his father had imagined and never lived to see. Kadak walked to the cairn behind the cabin, where the antler-handled knife sat on top of the stacked stones, and he put his hand on it the way a man puts his hand on a Bible. "It's ready, Pa," he said. "Almost. Just a little more time, and then we'll see who was the fool." September came with teeth. The first frost hit on the third day of the month, a week earlier than Kadak had expected, and it killed the last of the wild plants he'd been gathering to supplement his food stores. He woke to find ice on the inside of the cabin windows, and Cadful pressed so tight against him the dog was practically underneath him. The fire had burned low overnight, that old familiar terror, but the cabin was cold, not deadly. Not yet. The real cold was still weeks away. He spent the first week of September in a frenzy of preparation. He hunted every morning, killing 2 deer in 3 days, and butchering them quickly, hanging the strips of meat on a drying rack he'd built near the fire. The venison dried slowly in the cooling air, and he turned each piece twice a day to keep the moisture even. He hauled sacks of cornmeal from Thomas Wick's trading post, 2 trips 24 miles round each time, with the pack frame cutting into his shoulders. He filled every clay pot he owned with water from the creek, and sealed them with beeswax melted in an iron spoon over the fire. He stacked firewood against the cabin's north wall, 4 cords enough to burn through February if he was careful. Not because he planned to depend on it, but because Samuel Crow's voice lived in his head now. Always have a backup for the backup. On September 12th, he carried the food stores underground. 60 pounds of dried venison wrapped in oilcloth and stacked in the storage alcove. 40 pounds of cornmeal in leather sacks. 6 sealed pots of water, a small bag of salt, a tin of rendered bear grease for cooking, flint and steel, though he hoped not to need fire below. Tallow candles, 14 of them, each one good for 8 hours. His father's journal, the drafting case Peter Lowell had given him, the thermometer. He stood in the chamber and looked at the supplies arranged along the walls, and he calculated. If he rationed carefully, a pound of venison and half a pound of cornmeal per day, he could survive underground for 8 weeks without resurfacing. That was twice as long as any winter storm on record. But Kadak had learned from his father's death that the thing you didn't prepare for was the thing that killed you. "Enough," he said to Cadful, who was exploring the chamber with his nose pressed to every crack and corner. "It's enough." The dog found the water seep in the lower wall and lapped at it experimentally. The water was clean, filtered through 20 feet of stone and clay, and it tasted faintly of minerals. Cadful approved. That night, Kadak made his last trip to Willow Fork before winter. Thomas Wick was behind the counter, as always wearing a wool coat now against the chill that crept through the log walls of the trading post. "Chamber's finished," Kadak said. Thomas looked at him over the rim of his coffee cup. "Everything. Both entrances, ventilation, drainage, stone lining, storage. I tested it overnight in August. Held 53 degrees with both hatches sealed. And the connecting tunnel. The one that caved." Kadak was surprised Thomas knew about that. Then he realized he shouldn't be news traveled through the trapping community like water through rock, finding every crack and crevice. "Shored and stable. I reinforced it with double poles after the collapse." Thomas set his cup down. "You're ready then?" "I'm ready." The old man reached under the counter and brought out a small package wrapped in brown paper. He pushed it across the wood toward Kadak. "What's this, boy? Open it." Kadak unfolded the paper. Inside was a brass thermometer, new, precise, with markings etched in fine lines down to single-degree intervals. Better than his father's old mercury tube, by an order of magnitude. "Peter Lowell ordered it for you from St. Louis," Thomas said. "Had it shipped to me 3 weeks ago. He said to tell you he expects temperature readings every day through the winter. He'll come collect them in spring." Kadak turned the thermometer over in his hands. The brass was cool and heavy, the glass tube perfectly straight. It was the finest instrument he'd ever held. Don't say you can't accept it, just say thank you." "Thank you." Thomas nodded. Then his expression shifted, and Kadak recognized the look. It was the one the old man wore when he had bad news. Harlan Meeks put together a petition. Kadak went still. "A petition for what?" "He's asking the territorial authority to condemn your cabin. Says it's structurally compromised by the excavation underneath it. Says the digging has undermined the foundation, and the whole thing could collapse, making it a hazard. Thomas paused. He got 11 signatures. The words hit Kadak like a physical blow. He gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself. He can't do that. The cabin is on my father's claim. I inherited it. You're 14. Legally, you're a minor. The territorial authority could appoint a guardian, and that guardian could decide what happens to the property. Harlan's volunteered for the role. Harlan wants my land. Harlan wants to be right. He wants your chamber to fail, and if he can't make it fail on its own, he'll use the law to tear it apart. Thomas leaned forward. I've sent a letter to the territorial judge in Bannack explaining the situation. Peter Lowell countersigned it, and so did Dr. Voss. She has standing with the Army Corps, which carries weight. But the letter takes 3 weeks to arrive, and winter could close the passes before a response comes back. Kadak's mind raced. If the territorial authority sided with Harlan, if they condemned the cabin and appointed him guardian, Harlan could legally fill in the chamber, tear down the structure, and force Kadak off the mountain. Everything he'd built, everything his father had imagined, gone because one man's pride couldn't tolerate being proven wrong. What do I do? You survive the winter, Thomas said. You survive it in that chamber, and when spring comes, you'll have proof that the structure is sound, the cabin is intact, and Harlan's petition is nonsense. The judge will rule on evidence, not opinions. Give him evidence. Kadak picked up the thermometer and the supplies he'd come for, and walked to the door. Kadak. He turned. Harlan's petition isn't just about your cabin. 3 of the men who signed it trap the same drainage you do. If your claim gets condemned and you lose the land those trap lines open up, there's money in this. Don't forget that. Kadak felt something cold settle in his gut, colder than any winter temperature, colder than the night his father died. It was the understanding that men didn't just oppose you because they thought you were wrong. Sometimes they opposed you because your success threatened their livelihood, and they'd use any tool available, mockery petitions, the law itself, to pull you down. I won't forget, he said. The walk home felt longer than 12 miles. Cadfael sensed his mood and stayed close, pressing his flank against Kadak's leg every few steps. The boy walked in silence, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached, turning Thomas's words over and over in his mind. Survive the winter. Give him evidence, all right? He'd give them evidence they couldn't argue with. He'd take temperature readings every single day, surface, cabin, and chamber. He'd note the weather conditions, the wind speed, the snowfall. He'd document everything in the journal with the precision of a scientist, because that's what Dr. Voss had treated him as, and that's what Peter Lowell expected of him. When spring came, he wouldn't just have a survival story. He'd have data. Numbers didn't care about petitions or signatures or Harlan Meeks's wounded pride. He reached the cabin at dusk, fed Cadfael, and sat down at the crude table his father had built. He opened Griffith's journal to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. Below it he wrote Day 1 of winter record. Surface temperature 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Cabin temperature 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Chamber temperature 53.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind moderate from the northwest. Sky clear. He stared at the numbers for a moment, then added one more line. They want me to fail. I won't. October hit the mountain hard. The temperature dropped steadily, 40 degrees 30-25. The first snow fell on October 9th and didn't melt. By the 15th, 6 inches covered the ground and the creek was running sluggish with ice forming along the banks. Kadak's trap lines were still producing. Beaver pelts were at their thickest now, dense and rich, worth twice what summer pelts brought at the trading post. He ran the lines every other day, stretching and storing pelts in the cabin, building a reserve of trade goods for spring. He took his temperature readings religiously. Every morning at dawn, every evening at dusk. The surface temperature plunged with each passing week, but the chamber held steady. 53, 53.2, 52.8, never varying more than a degree. The Earth's patience was absolute, indifferent to the chaos above. On October 21st, the Grizzly came back. Kadak was in the cabin working on the hatch cover for the main entrance, reinforcing it with cross braces so it could support the weight of snow accumulation. Cadful was asleep near the fire. The dog's head snapped up without warning, and a growl rumbled from deep in his chest, the low primal sound that meant something dangerous was close. Kadak grabbed the Hawken. He moved to the door and pressed his ear against the wood. Heavy breathing, the scrape of claws, a weight pushing against the north wall that made the logs creak. The bear was at the cabin. He backed away from the door and pulled Cadful toward the main shaft. If the bear broke in, they'd go underground. The hatches were solid 3 inches of pine braced with iron, and no grizzly could dig through 19 feet of earth and stone to reach the chamber. But the bear didn't break in. It circled the cabin twice. Kadak tracked its movement by sound, the heavy footfalls passing each wall in sequence, and then it stopped at the lean-to. The cairn, his father's grave marker. Kadak heard the stones being knocked aside. The bear grunted and huffed, probably smelling whatever traces of scent remained in the ground beneath. Kadak stood at the shaft opening with the Hawken aimed at the cabin door and waited. After 20 minutes, the sounds moved away. The heavy footfalls receded into the forest, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. Cadful's growl subsided to a whimper, then stopped. Kadak lowered the rifle, but didn't uncock it. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall and held the weapon across his knees, the way he'd held it in June. The bear had come for the same reason it had come before, drawn by the remnants of death, but the body was long gone. There was nothing left at the cairn except stones and a skinning knife. Eventually, the bear would stop coming. Or eventually the bear would try harder to get in. Either way, the chamber was the answer. Underground, the bear was irrelevant. Underground predators were a surface problem, literally. November arrived, and with it the cold that Kadak had been building against since February. The temperature hit 0 on November 4th and stayed below freezing for 9 consecutive days. Snow piled against the cabin walls, climbing inch by inch until it reached the windowsill. The wind blew from the north with a force that rattled the door in its frame and drove fine powder snow through gaps in the log, chinking that Kadak had to reseal every other day with fresh mud and moss. He was living a split life now, days in the cabin where the fire kept the temperature bearable, and nights in the chamber where the steady 53 degrees made sleep effortless. Each evening, he banked the cabin fire, sealed the main hatch from below, and descended into the warm, quiet earth. Each morning, he climbed back up, rebuilt the fire, and went about the surface work, checking traps, hauling firewood, taking his temperature readings. The readings told a story that grew more dramatic every day. November 8th. Surface temperature, -12 degrees Fahrenheit. Cabin with fire, 38 degrees. Chamber, 53. The gap between surface and underground was 65 degrees. In February, that gap could reach 90 or more. On November 15th, Jedediah Hall showed up. Kadak almost didn't recognize him. The big, slow-moving man who'd accompanied Harlan in the spring was gaunt now, his cheeks hollow, his eyes dark-circled. He walked up to the cabin on foot, no horse carrying a bedroll and a rifle, and nothing else. "I need help," Jedediah said. No greeting, no preamble, just 3 words pushed through cracked lips. Kadak opened the door wider and let him in. Cadful sniffed the man's boots and retreated to his corner. Jedediah sank onto the bench near the fire and held his hands toward the heat. They were shaking. "What happened?" "Cabin burned. 3 nights ago. Chimney fire. Lost everything: food, pelts, tools, powder. I've been walking since." "Where's Harlan? Where's Ray?" Jedediah's face tightened. "Harlan's in his cabin 10 miles south. Wouldn't take me in. Said he didn't have supplies to spare." He paused, and the bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. "Ray's gone. Left for the settlements before the snow got deep. Smart man." Kadak stared at the man who had stood beside Harlan Meeks and watched while Harlan mocked a 14-year-old boy's life's work. The man who had signed the petition to condemn his cabin. The man who had said nothing while Kadak was told he was wasting his time. "You signed Harlan's petition," Kadak said. Jedediah didn't look up. "I did." "You tried to take my land." "I did." "And now you're asking me for help." Jedediah raised his eyes. There was no defiance in them, no excuse, no attempt at justification. Just exhaustion and the raw, undeniable truth of a man who had run out of options. "I'm asking you to not let me die," he said. "That's all. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for friendship. I'm asking to survive the night." Kadak looked at this man, broken, starving, humiliated, and he felt two things at once. The first was anger, bright and hot, the kind that wanted to point at the door and say, "Go ask Harlan for help since you trusted his judgment over mine." The second was something deeper, older, more fundamental. It was the voice of his father, who had never turned a man away from his fire, no matter the grievance. It was the voice of Samuel Crow, who had opened his hatch to a stranger's boy without hesitation. It was the voice of Thomas Wick, who gave help because help was needed, not because it was earned. "Sit," Kadak said. "Eat." He gave Jedediah dried venison and cornmeal mush cooked over the fire. The man ate with the desperate mechanical intensity of someone who hadn't had a full meal in 3 days. Cadful watched from his corner, tolerant, but not friendly. When Jedediah finished eating, Kadak made a decision. "I'll show you the chamber," he said. Jedediah followed him to the shaft and looked down into the darkness. Kadak lit a candle and descended first, and Jedediah followed slowly, clumsily, his big frame barely fitting through the entrance. When he reached the chamber floor, he stood motionless. "It's warm," he said. His voice was thick with something Kadak recognized, because he'd felt it himself, the shock of discovering that safety existed where you'd been told it couldn't. 53 degrees, always. Jedediah pressed his hand against the stone wall. He looked at the arched ceiling, the ventilation shafts, the storage alcoves, the sleeping platform. He looked at the drainage channel and the sump pit and the water seep that provided clean drinking water year-round. He looked at every detail of a structure he'd been told was foolish, built by a boy he'd been told was wasting his time. "God Almighty," he whispered. "You can stay until you're strong enough to travel," Kadak said. "But I need you to understand something. This chamber, this thing you and Harlan said would fail, is the reason I can take you in. Without it, I'd be surviving on fire and hope same as you were, same as my father was. There wouldn't be room for charity." Jedediah looked at the boy. 14 years old, standing in a structure he'd carved from the mountain with his own hands, offering shelter to a man who'd tried to destroy him. "I was wrong," Jedediah said, "about all of it. I know. Your father would have been—" "Don't." Kadak's voice was sharp. "Don't tell me what my father would have been. I know what he was. I know what he would have done. That's why you're standing here instead of freezing in the snow." Jedediah went quiet. He sat on the chamber floor with his back against the stone wall and closed his eyes. And within minutes, the warmth and the safety and the absolute exhaustion pulled him under. He slept for 14 hours straight. Kadak climbed back up to the cabin, stoked the fire, and sat down with the journal. He wrote the day's temperature readings, then added a note beneath them. Jedediah Hall arrived today. Cabin burned. Harlan turned him away. I did not. Chamber holding at 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The earth does not ask whether a man deserves warmth. He read the line back to himself, and then he read it again, and he realized that he'd stopped writing like a boy keeping records, and started writing like a man keeping a testament. Cadful climbed into his lap, all 40 pounds of him, and Kadak wrapped his arms around the dog and held on. The fire crackled, the wind howled. The chamber below held steady, warm and patient, waiting for the worst the mountain could send. And the worst was coming. Kadak could feel it not in the temperature or the wind or the snow, but in something older and less definable, a pressure in the air, a silence in the forest. The animals had gone deep. The birds had gone south. The creek had stopped running, entirely locked under a sheet of ice that grew thicker every night. The real cold. The killing cold, the cold that had taken Griffith Pritchard, was gathering itself in the north, and when it came, it would come without mercy and without warning, and everything Kadak had built would either hold or it wouldn't, and there would be no second chances. He held the dog tighter, and he waited. The killing cold came on December 2nd. Kadak felt it before dawn, a drop so sudden and so savage that the cabin walls popped and cracked as the wood contracted. He sat up in the darkness and knew the way an animal knows that this was different from every cold snap that had come before. This was the cold that had taken his father. This was the one he'd been building against for 9 months. He checked the thermometer. The mercury had plunged below the lowest marking on his father's old instrument. He grabbed the brass thermometer Peter Lowell had sent and held it near the window crack where outside air seeped through. Negative 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Jedediah. Kadak shook the man's shoulder. Jedediah had been sleeping on the cabin floor near the fire for 3 weeks now, regaining his strength, helping with trap lines to earn his keep. Get up. We're going below. Jedediah rolled over groggy. What is it? 36 below and still dropping. The fire won't hold the cabin. We go underground now. Jedediah needed no further persuasion. He'd been inside the chamber enough times to understand what it offered. He pulled on his boots and coat, while Kadak banked the cabin fire not to keep the cabin warm, but to prevent the embers from sparking against the floorboards while they were below. He sealed the flue damper, checked the hatch covers, and grabbed Cadful by the scruff. Down, he told the dog. Ted. Cadful descended the steps with the practiced ease of an animal who'd made the trip dozens of times. Jedediah followed, then Kadak pulling the hatch cover closed behind him and dropping the locking bar into place. The chamber received them the way it always did. Steady, warm, unchanged. 53 degrees. The candle flame burned straight and still untouched by wind. The air moved gently through the ventilation shafts, carrying the faintest breath of cold from the surface that mixed with the chamber's warmth and dissolved into nothing. They sat in the quiet. Kadak on the sleeping platform. Jedediah on the floor against the far wall, Cadful stretched between them with his nose on his paws. How long can this storm last? Jedediah asked. The worst one on record hit in 29. Thomas said it lasted 11 days. Temperatures never came above -20 the whole time. Killed 14 trappers along the divide. 11 days underground? If that's what it takes. Jedediah was quiet for a while. Then he said something Kadak hadn't expected. I want to tell you why I signed Harlan's petition. Kadak looked at him. You don't have to. I do. Because you took me in, and you deserve to know what kind of man you took in. Jedediah rubbed his face with both hands. Harlan told me your trap lines would come open if your claim got condemned. Told me I could run the drainage east of the creek, that's 6 miles of prime beaver water. I signed because I wanted those lines. Not because I thought your chamber would fail. I knew it might work. I signed anyway. The honesty of it was almost worse than the betrayal itself. Kadak sat with the words for a long moment, turning them over the way he turned stones in his hands before fitting them into the chamber wall. You knew it might work, he repeated. I watched you carry stone from the slide field one afternoon. I was hunting the ridge above your cabin, and I saw you this scrawny kid dragging slabs of shale uphill on a pole sled, making trip after trip for hours. And I thought that boy is going to finish this thing. He's going to do what his daddy couldn't. Jedediah's voice dropped. And then I went to Harlan's cabin and I signed the paper that would have taken it all away from you. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm sitting in the thing I tried to destroy and it's keeping me alive. And I need you to know that I understand what that means. Kadak looked at the man. The shame on his face, the rawness in his eyes, the way his hands gripped his own knees as if bracing for a blow. And Kadak realized something that surprised him. He didn't hate Jedediah. He'd thought he would. He'd imagined this conversation and assumed the anger would surge up, bright and righteous. But it didn't. What he felt instead was exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying a weight so long, you've forgotten what it felt like to set it down. The chamber doesn't care who's in it, Kadak said. The earth gives warmth to whoever goes deep enough. That's the whole point. It doesn't judge. It doesn't choose. Jedediah nodded slowly. Your father raised a better man than most of us deserve. My father raised a boy who got angry and dug a hole. Everything else happened because of the hole. Despite everything, Jedediah almost smiled. The storm raged above them for 6 days. Kadak tracked it through temperature readings, taking the brass thermometer up through the hatch twice daily. Quick trips no more than 5 minutes on the surface, just long enough to check the instrument and note the conditions. Day 2, -41 degrees. Day 3, -38, with wind that drove the effective temperature far lower. Day 4, -44. The cabin was an icebox. Frost coated every surface: the walls, the table, the bench, the rifle barrel hanging on its pegs. The fire was dead, the ashes frozen solid. Kadak's breath crystallized in the air above the hatch the moment he opened it, forming a cloud of ice crystals that hung motionless in the still lethal cold. Each time he descended back into the chamber, the warmth wrapped around him like arms. 53 degrees. 53.1. The earth held its temperature with a faithfulness that nothing else in Kadak's life had ever matched. Not fire, not people, not promises. The earth simply was what it was, and it gave what it gave, and it asked nothing in return except to be trusted. On the 5th day they heard something. Kadak was lying on the sleeping platform half asleep, when Cadful's head snapped up. The dog's ears rotated forward, and a low growl built in his throat. "Easy," Kadak said. Then he heard it too. A pounding on the cabin door above, muffled by 19 feet of earth, barely audible but unmistakable. Someone was at the cabin. He climbed the shaft fast, unlocked the hatch, and pushed it open into the frozen air. The cabin was dark and ice-coated. He crossed to the door, gripped the latch, and pulled. Harlan Meeks fell through the doorway. The big man collapsed onto the cabin floor, his beard crusted with ice, his lips blue-white, his eyes half-closed. His coat was stiff with frost and his hands ungloved raw. The color of tallow were curled into claws against his chest. "Help me," Harlan said. His voice was a rasp barely louder than the wind outside. "Kadak, please." Kadak stood over the man who had laughed at his father. The man who had mocked his chamber. The man who had petitioned to condemn his cabin and take his land. The man who had turned Jedediah away when Jedediah needed shelter. That man was now lying on Kadak's floor, dying of the same cold he'd insisted fire could conquer. Kadak didn't hesitate. He grabbed Harlan under the arms and dragged him across the cabin floor to the shaft. Harlan was twice his weight, dead weight, now barely conscious. Kadak braced his feet and pulled his back, screaming, his shoulders burning. "Jedediah!" he shouted down the shaft. "Get up here, I need you." Jedediah's face appeared at the bottom of the shaft, and when he saw who Kadak was dragging, his expression went through shock, anger, and resignation in the space of a single breath. He climbed up and grabbed Harlan's legs, and together they lowered the big man down the shaft. Sliding, bumping, scraping against the stone walls, until he lay on the chamber floor, shivering violently, his body trying to remember what warmth felt like. They stripped off his frozen coat and boots. They wrapped him in the elk hide from the sleeping platform. Jedediah pressed warm cloths soaked in the naturally heated seep water against Harlan's hands and feet, while Kadak monitored his breathing. The shivering intensified, which was good. Shivering meant the body was still fighting. "I walked," Harlan mumbled through chattering teeth. 10 miles. Fire went out." A sound escaped his throat, half laugh, half sob. "Fire went out." Kadak looked at Jedediah. The bigger man's jaw was tight, his eyes hard. "His fire went out," Jedediah said flatly. "Yeah." "Same as your father's." "Yeah." They said nothing else about it. There was nothing to say. The irony was so complete, so perfectly circular, that words would have diminished it. Harlan Meeks, the man who'd staked his reputation on fire being sufficient, had nearly died because fire wasn't sufficient. And the only thing standing between him and the same death as Griffith Pritchard was a hole in the ground dug by Griffith Pritchard's 14-year-old son. The chamber held 3 men and a dog for the next 36 hours. Harlan's core temperature came up slowly from dangerous to stable to safe over the course of the first night. His hands and feet would survive. The frostbite was superficial, painful, but not deep enough to kill tissue. He lay on the chamber floor, wrapped in hide, drinking warm water from the seep, staring at the arched stone ceiling with an expression that Kadak couldn't read and didn't try to. On the 7th morning, Kadak climbed up through the hatch and felt something different. The air was still cold -18, but the vicious bone-cracking intensity had broken. The wind had shifted. The pressure had lifted. "It's easing," he called down. By noon, the temperature had climbed to -4. By evening, it was 8 above zero. The storm was over. Kadak rebuilt the cabin fire for the first time in a week. The logs caught slowly, reluctantly, the wood stiff and ice saturated, but they caught. Heat crept back into the cabin, and the frost on the walls began to weep. Harlan climbed out of the chamber on his own, one slow step at a time. He sat on the bench near the fire and held his bandaged hands toward the heat. Jedediah emerged behind him and stood against the wall, arms crossed, watching. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Harlan looked at Kadak. The boy was standing by the table writing temperature readings in the journal, the same journal he'd maintained every day, without exception the record that Peter Lowell had asked for the evidence that Thomas Wick had told him to gather. "What's the temperature in the chamber right now?" Harlan asked. 53.2. "And the surface when you came up?" 8 above zero. "And the lowest you recorded during the storm?" -44. Harlan closed his eyes. 97 degrees of difference between where I was dying and where you saved me. 97.2. Kadak corrected. "Not to be precise, to be honest." Harlan opened his eyes and looked at the boy, really looked the way a man looks at something he's forced himself to see for the first time, despite it being right in front of him for months. "I killed your father," Harlan said. "No." I laughed at his idea. I told him it was foolish. He believed me, and he stopped building, and the fire went out, and he died. I killed him. Kadak set down the pencil. He turned to face Harlan fully, and what Harlan saw in the boy's face was not anger, not forgiveness, not the simple mercy of youth. It was something harder and more complex, the look of someone who has processed a truth so thoroughly that it no longer owns him. "My father made his own choice," Kadak said. "You influenced it, but he made it. If I blamed you for everything, I'd have to blame Samuel Crow for not riding south to convince him, and Thomas Wick for not arguing harder, and my mother for dying when I was 3 and leaving him alone up here without anyone to tell him he was right. Blame runs in every direction once you let it loose. I chose to dig instead." Harlan stared at the boy. Then his head dropped forward and his shoulders shook, and he wept, not quietly, not with dignity, but with the wrenching, ugly sobs of a grown man confronting something he'd spent a year trying to outrun. Jedediah looked away. Cadfael whined softly. Kadak didn't comfort him. That wasn't his job. His job was to survive and to build and to record what worked, and he'd done all three. Harlan's reckoning was Harlan's own. When the sobs subsided, Harlan wiped his face with his bandaged hands and stood up. He was unsteady, still weak, but something in his posture had changed. A stiffness that had been there for as long as Kadak had known him was gone, replaced by something smaller and more honest. "I'll withdraw the petition," Harlan said, "and I'll help you build another chamber, a bigger one, near the trading post where anyone can use it, if you'll show me how." Kadak studied the man's face. He looked for deception and found none. He looked for pity and found none. What he found was the simple, devastating humility of a man who'd been wrong about something that mattered and who was willing to say so out loud. "I'll show you," Kadak said. Spring came late that year, mid-April, before the snow line retreated enough to open the pass to Bannock. Peter Lowell arrived on the first clear day, riding hard with a leather satchel full of blank journals and a letter from the territorial judge. The letter dismissed Harlan Meeks's petition, entirely citing the countersignature of Dr. Eleanor Voss of the Army Corps and the professional testimony of Peter Lowell of the American Fur Company. Kadak's claim was secure. The cabin, the land, and the chamber beneath it were his. Peter spent 3 days in the chamber, measuring, sketching, recording. He compared Kadak's winter journal entries against his own calculations and found them precise to a degree that surprised him. 112 consecutive daily readings, Peter said, flipping through the journal. Not a single day missed. Through a storm that killed 8 men along the divide. 9, Kadak corrected. Thomas told me about the 9th yesterday, Peter closed the journal and looked at the boy. Dr. Voss's report is being circulated in Washington. The Army Corps is sending a survey team next summer to study your chamber and build a prototype at Fort Hall. They want you to consult. I'm 15. You're the only person in the territory who's built one of these and survived a winter in it. Your age is irrelevant. Kadak thought about that. He thought about his father who'd had the idea and hadn't built it. He thought about Samuel Crow, who'd built one and been called crazy. He thought about Harlan Meeks weeping on a bench, his pride finally smaller than the truth. He thought about Jedediah Hall sleeping on a chamber floor that he'd tried to legislate out of existence. He thought about Thomas Wick, who'd given respect before it was earned, and Dr. Voss, who'd put his father's name first, and Cadfull, who'd never once doubted where warmth came from. I'll do it, he said, but the design stays open. No patents, no ownership. Anyone who wants to build a chamber builds one. That's the condition. Peter raised his eyebrows. You could make a fortune licensing this. My father died because knowledge was ridiculed instead of shared. I won't lock it behind money. The Earth's warmth belongs to everyone who's willing to dig deep enough to find it. Peter Lowell shook his head slowly the way men do when they encounter something they didn't expect from the world. He wrote the condition into his report and signed it. By the following winter, 3 underground chambers had been built along the divide. One at Willow Fork supervised by Kadak and built with Harlan Meeks's labor. One near Flathead Lake expanded from Samuel Crow's original. And one at Fort Hall engineered by the Army Corps using Kadak's specifications. None of the men who sheltered in them that winter died. Not one. Kadak Pritchard ran his father's trap lines until he was 22. He consulted on 17 underground chambers across the Rocky Mountain Territory. He never charged for the knowledge. He kept Griffith's journal until the leather binding fell apart, and then he copied every entry into a new book and kept going. He recorded temperatures every day for 31 years without missing a single reading. The data filled 14 volumes, and they were donated to the Army Corps Library after his death. He never forgot the sound of Harlan Meeks laughing. But he also never forgot the sound of Harlan Meeks weeping, and in the end the second sound mattered more than the first. The chamber beneath his cabin stood for 67 years. When it finally collapsed undermined by a shifting water table in 1903, the stones were still fitted tight, the mortar still solid, the arch still holding. It took nature 67 years to undo what a 14-year-old boy had built with a pick, a star drill, and the unshakable belief that the earth would not betray him the way fire had, and it never did.